a glimpse into our historical, cultural, and natural heritage, North Carolina Scenic Byways presents Lafayette's Tour.
Thank God we have our freedom won. Thank Lafayette and Washington and all the heroes that are gone who fought to set us free.
In 1825, as the nation's guest, a famous French general named Lafayette was conducted on a triumphant tour throughout our new nation. The approximate route he followed in northeastern North Carolina parallels part of this North Carolina Scenic Byway. After crossing the Virginia border, Lafayette traveled east to west, from Murfreesboro to the former seat of government at Halifax, on the way to the new state capital in Raleigh. Cannons boomed and artillery burst forth to greet Lafayette at each town on his tour. Eager to properly receive the great revolutionary hero, North Carolinians remembered how Lafayette and French soldiers joined forces with Washington's troops to defeat the British. Lafayette had fought for freedom twice, the first time on American soil, the second time on his own. Now that he returned for this grand tour, this older, dignified Frenchman looked forward to the hospitality and warm Southern welcome he would receive. When bells rang, the town and county residents of Halifax knew that General Lafayette was crossing the Roanoke River. When he arrived at the piazza, men raised their hats, women waved their handkerchiefs, and speeches were made to honor Lafayette. The speaker of the keynote address recalled Halifax's historic past.
We have the pleasure to receive Lafayette at Halifax, which may be considered as the birthplace of the freedom of North Carolina. It was here that the Constitution of our state was formed, and it was under this very roof that the legislature voted to aid the Revolution, in which you, sir, played so distinguished a part.
This statement stirred emotions and reminded the hosts of the role that the Halifax Resolves, signed in 1776, played in the American Revolution. North Carolina was the first colony to endorse a resolution that our colonies become independent from England. After the introductory ceremonies, Lafayette was conducted from his lodgings at the Eagle Hotel to a drawing room where he was formally introduced to the ladies. Everyone observed his courtesy and respect. That evening, a formal banquet was prepared, and the most prominent citizens had a chance to offer their congratulations to Lafayette. Many grand toasts were proposed.
The state of North Carolina, the town of Halifax, early asserting the principles of liberty, may they long enjoy its blessing.
The rising generation, may they follow the example of Washington and Lafayette.
Merci, monsieur.
The Roanoke River Valley was settled in the early 1700s by colonists who found the valley's fertile bottomlands ideal for large-scale farming. Early settlers from Virginia and North Carolina shared trade and culture. By the late 18th century, a society of merchants, craftsmen, wealthy planters, small farmers, slaves, and freedmen had evolved in northeastern North Carolina. This region was the nation's center for horse racing before it moved to Kentucky. Much rich revolutionary and antebellum history can be uncovered as we visit the gracious towns located along the route of this scenic byway. As the northernmost point of navigation on the Meherrin River, Murfreesboro, first known as Murphy's Landing, was the farthest point a seagoing vessel might penetrate into the large and productive farming area. It was designated by Congress in 1790 as an official port of entry, and the customs records indicate profitable trade with New England and the West Indies. Successful ship merchants made Murfreesboro their home and impressed their outlook on the new town. They built impressive residences, such as this dwelling, which is now a museum. Each room of a historic house provides clues about the way people lived. Peek inside this children's room. See the chairs at the little table? Imagine playing checkers here or swaying back and forth on the rocking horse. Picture the older children as they climbed up into this big bed and the little ones that may have been tucked into the trundle below. If you were an older boy in the family, it was your chore to tighten the woven ropes that supported the mattress of a rope bed. That's where the expression comes from, sleep tight. A few doors down from the Wheeler House, in one of Murfreesboro's first commercial buildings, you find a typical law office. The judge that conducted business here had relatives that were French. Remember Lafayette? When citizens learned that the first place this famous general would stop in North Carolina was Murfreesboro, they selected Judge Manny to deliver the speech. It's possibly here, at this desk, that Manny wrote the welcoming address. Just a step away, inside the same museum, the focus shifts to a different type of history. Another of Murfreesboro's enterprising families, named the Gatlings, were inventors. The display showcases the famous and powerful Gatling gun. Used briefly in the Civil War, this revolving battery gun was the world's first successful machine gun. To get a feel for how things change, it's always fun to visit a country store. You could spend hours poking through the array of merchandise, examining how basic but clever everyday items were when first mass-produced. To better understand how people lived, historians take a close look at artifacts. They ask, why were these items needed? Did that make life easier or more complicated? How did that change our culture and way of life? As a river port, Halifax was founded on the south bank of the Roanoke River in 1760 and became the county seat. Some public buildings in the historic district were fashioned of brick and were fireproof. The clerk's office served as a location for storing valuable court records. The printer's office is complete with a working press. Here you see how a galley was loaded with type, which had to be carefully arranged. Printers had to watch closely how letters were sequenced, minding their P's and Q's. The printer turned a large screw to press the paper against the inked type. Sheets of paper were run through the press, one sheet at a time. Printing a newspaper this way took a lot of time and care. Halifax was a crossroads and a social center. Inns and taverns did a brisk business. Many Federal-style plantation buildings were constructed here. Contrasting with the life of plantation owners was the life of slaves that contributed to the economic prosperity of this rich life. Seldom mentioned, George Moses Horton, born a slave in Northampton County, taught himself to read and write poetry. He wrote the first book published in the South by a black man and called it The Hope of Liberty. Warrenton was established at the time of the American Revolution, an earlier cry for freedom. Like many other towns in this region, its citizens were patriots. Virtually every man in the county swore allegiance to North Carolina. Many served in the county militia. Direct descendants of those revolutionaries still live in the town and surrounding country. By the 1840s, Warrenton was a bustling trade center, also thriving on the wealth of tobacco and cotton plantations of the Roanoke Valley. Warrenton even owned its own railroad. Fine schools, a college and academy were established to educate its citizens. Today, the courthouse remains on the same town square that was drawn up in the original plot for the town. Stroll along the side streets to study the grace of the many fine homes, which reflect Warrenton's early prosperity. The Warrenton style displays dignified porches and entrances that include intricate detail. Great care was taken to build these grand homes. There are many different styles of architecture in Warrenton, including bracketed roof lines and arched window decorations. Warrenton was home to many successful people. This marker indicates the boyhood home of the Bragg brothers, who were lawyers, politicians, and soldiers active during the Confederacy. And this is the home site of John A. Hyman, North Carolina's first black congressman, who won election after the Civil War. Like many small towns on this scenic byway, Warrenton has interesting historic appeal. its main street and relaxed atmosphere where people greet and shop serve the same function, but look and feel different than the malls of today. Across rolling hills and centered between Warrenton and Halifax is Mead Oak Mountain, which presents a different type of history. The park sits near the fall line, an area where the hard, resistant rocks of the foothills give way to the softer rocks and sediments of the coastal plain. Cloaked in a forest of green, this hill is not really a mountain at all, because its highest point reaches an elevation of only 325 feet above sea level. The elongated ridge is the granite core of what was once a mighty range of mountains. The peaks were formed by volcanic action during the Paleozoic age, millions of years ago. This rugged terrain with very steep slopes is unusual for the eastern Piedmont. Creeks carved their way through the rock and spread rich soil to their sides. Some of the mountain forest has been cut for timber, but the wilderness character of Mead Oak Mountain is returning. Out of old fields once used for farming, loblolly pines and hardwoods grow, stretch, and reach to the sky. Wild wetlands once covered much of northeastern North Carolina. The eastern part of the Lafayette's Tour Byway brings you to the scenic beauty of Merchant's Mill Pond. Near the end of the route, you can catch a glimpse of the fabled Dismal Swamp. The wetlands found within Merchant's Mill Pond State Park, including part of Lassiter Swamp, cover approximately 1,000 acres. Many years ago, Merchant's Mill Pond was the site of a sawmill and a grist mill for corn and wheat, as well as a trade center. Unlike the nearby Dismal Swamp, Merchant's Mill Pond has not been drained in the 190-plus years of its history, so it takes on the natural characteristics of a classic swamp. Here you see tupelo gum and bald cypress trees, with their feet rooted in the base of the swamp. In many places, Spanish moss drapes the trees. Today, this peaceful and magical place gives you a feel for what it might have been like for early colonists to venture forth into the great Dismal Swamp.
Away to the Dismal Swamp he speeds. His path was rugged and sore, through tangled juniper beds of reeds, where man never trod before.
This mysterious and gloomy swamp, grown thick with briars and berries, seems to go on, but it is actually much smaller than it was originally. There are stories of Indians hunting in its depths, and tales of runaway slaves hiding in its dense forests. The first survey team charged with demarcating the state line in the early 1700s considered it a wasteland that could not easily be explored. But later, in an effort to make the land useful for plantation farming, George Washington organized the Dismal Swamp Land Company. His adventurers surveyed this area, drained part of the swamp, and built the first 2 small ditches, or canals. Over time, huge cypress and juniper trees were harvested around the edges of the swamp for shingles, staves, and logs. Water flow was disrupted and wildlife disturbed. Later, to transport tobacco and other crops from Virginia to the Tidewater, the Eastern Canal was enlarged. Eventually, this was recognized as the Dismal Swamp Canal. A Civil War battle was held at the locks near South Mills when Union forces were prevented from blowing up the locks to keep Confederate supplies from coming down the canal. Originally very extensive, 22,000 square miles, this marsh, lake, and cypress swamp is much smaller in size and measures only 37 miles long and up to 12 miles wide. Today, no virgin timbers are left in the swamp. But now, this area is a national wildlife refuge, which protects these forested wetlands. Like water that mirrors slowly shifting clouds, nature reflects changes as time moves along. Like rivers that run swiftly by the towns on Lafayette's tour, the history of this region cuts a course that is proud and strong, a history that harks back to revolutionary times.